Welcome to the Fostoria Area Church's online service. It is the first Sunday of Lent. I forgot to change that on my slide. It still says Transfiguration Sunday, which was last week. But as you can tell by our new purple themed online service, it is now the first Sunday in Lent. And during Lent, we remember that the God of all creation cares for us even in our times of trial, even as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And so, knowing this, let us begin with prayer. Faithful one, the promises you made to our ancestors continue even to this day. We too share the bounty of your blessings, dwelling in a land flowing with milk and honey. Burn the truth of Paul's words into our very souls, that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Amen. Now, we are continuing our sermon series on the Weird Gospel. It's the first Sunday of Lent, and so that means there's still plenty of time before Easter to finish your reading challenge, to read the entire Gospel of John. You have just a little less than 50 days, so that's plenty of time to finish, I think. And we are reading the book of John. I'm not finished with it yet. I'm about halfway through because I'm just kind of going along with what we're preaching, and we are about at the halfway point of John right now. So, the first half of the weird gospel that we've been learning about has been really about Jesus's ministry. It's been Jesus traveling, preaching, doing miracles, and that ministry culminates in him having to flee Jerusalem when he angers the wrong people who decide they have to kill him. In today's passage, Jesus makes a critical decision. He makes the decision to return to Jerusalem to heal a beloved disciple of his named Lazarus. And this is the moment where Jesus, knowing that returning to Jerusalem means certain death, where Jesus chooses to lay down his life for a friend. And so it's the doorway into the season of Lent, where we remember that we are dust, and we choose to hold on a little more loosely to our fragile lives, giving up what is temporary in exchange for a love and a life that is eternal. It's the first step for Jesus on that path to the cross. And so let's read this weird gospel together. If you have a Bible at home and you're trying to follow along, it says John 11, but I skipped around a lot because it's a very long passage, and I don't want to keep you here all day. And plus, you're at home reading it for your reading challenge, right? So you should have already read this. So you might want to just follow along on the screen because I skipped around. But let's read this together. A certain man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, the one whom you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus says, "This illness isn't fatal, it's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. After 2 days, he said to his disciples, "Let's return to Judea again." He continued, "Our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I am going in order to wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he will get well." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death. Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe. Let's go to him." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask God, God will give to you." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone covered the entrance. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, had said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days." Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his feet and his hands tied, and his face covered with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." The word of God for the people of God. Now, I'm going to say something controversial. Some of you might disagree with me on this, but just hear me out. What I'm going to say, this, it's just my opinion. What I'm going to say is that I think death is bad. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but I think death is bad. Just, the whole concept. Why do we have to die? Why does everyone have to die? I don't like any of that. On Wednesday, if you go to church in person here, you might have come for our Ash Wednesday service, either at High Street or Wesley. And this is the day when we get a little cross of ashes put on our forehead, and we are asked to remember that we are dust. At that service at Wesley, I talked about in my sermon that day about how I don't really need a reminder that I'm dust. Death is all around us every day. There's COVID, there's war, there's natural disasters, there's accidents, and there's tragedies, and there's just seemingly no end to these reminders of death in our world today. I sure don't like it. I don't like this whole concept of death, but when death hits close to home, it goes from dislikable to totally unbearable. So I wonder, why do we celebrate Lent? Why do we have a whole season of the church year where we just put death at the forefront? Because death is bad. Death is the worst. I said earlier today that today's passage is really the turning point of the whole Gospel of John. It's right in the center. It's the hinge where everything turns, that this bridge that connects Jesus' life to his work on the cross. We are taking these first steps with Jesus through this door to Lent, taking these first steps toward the cross. And here at the center of the book of John, this hinge, this story, it's all about death. I mean, yeah, we know Lazarus raises from the dead. We read that part. We know this, but the miracle itself really only takes place in just one or two verses. It's very short. Whereas the passage is like 44 verses long, and most of it is about the awful reality of death and the impact that death makes on all of our lives. A lot of times we as a society, as a culture, we like to ignore death. And today's passage doesn't let us do that. Today's passage reminds us over and over and over again that Lazarus is dead. And not just dead, Lazarus is dead, dead. For instance, in our culture today, we like to use euphemisms for death. We don't like to say so and so died. We like to say they went home or they are in heaven. When my cat died, they told me we were going to put her to sleep and she's going to cross the rainbow bridge. And that all sounded really nice, but when you're up close and personal to the death of a pet or even worse, the death of a loved one, those euphemisms just don't hold true. They're like putting frosting on a mud pie. Like these nice phrases don't cover up the terrible reality when it's right in front of you. Jesus here first breaks the news of Lazarus' death to his disciples by saying, Lazarus is sleeping. I'm going to wake him up. And so he uses one of those euphemisms for death, but then he realizes that's not enough to convey the reality of what's happening here, to convey the reality of death and the pain it is causing. And so when his disciples respond, Lord, if he's sleeping, isn't he just going to get better? Well, Jesus needs to be clearer. He needs his disciples to understand the seeming finality of what has happened to Lazarus. There is no getting better, at least not on his own. And so verse 14 tells them, Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Death is the worst. In today's passage, we really see how death affects those who are living. Martha is the first of Jesus' speakers, or Jesus' sisters to speak to Jesus, and her response seems to be one of anger. She hears that Jesus is on his way and she goes out to confront him. I can just imagine her stomping to Jesus and pointing her finger up in his face and yelling, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I like Martha. She gets angry. She even gets angry at God. And isn't this just a normal response to death? It's a response that I think we probably all felt at one time, anger at God in response to death. I think it's also a biblical response to death. We see it here. We see it in the Psalms. I think God can handle our anger. Martha is not afraid to speak this terrible truth that I think we've all thought at one time, but we're sometimes afraid to say out loud, this idea that God could have done something, that God has the power and had the power to do something, and God did nothing. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. And she isn't easily consoled either. Jesus tells her, your brother will rise again. And she responds, look, I know that he will rise again on the last day. In other words, I know I'll see him in heaven. I know one day we'll all rise again, but that's not the point. The point is my life is worse off now because my brother is dead. And if you had been here, he would not be. Martha's anger, though, doesn't grow out of a lack of trust in God. On the contrary, she loves Jesus enough to know she can trust him with her truth. She doesn't have to say the right things. She doesn't have to pretend to be at peace. She doesn't have to pretend to have already accepted God's will in so short of a time. She's angry. She says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but she also has faith. She trusts Jesus. She also says, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. She doesn't know what God's will is. She doesn't like how God handled this situation, and she doesn't lie about that, but also her faith never wavers. And it's because of her strong faith that she is able to be honest with Jesus. If you notice, Jesus never scolds her, he simply invites her to look at death from a new perspective. So that's Martha's response to death. Martha's sister Mary has a different response. She uses the same words, but I think there are different emotions behind them. They say that if you dig into anger deeply enough, you find grief underneath. And Mary's mask of anger slips off a lot more easily than Martha's. She comes to Jesus at first with that same angry accusation that her sister has. She says, "Lord, if you had been here." But I imagine her kind of choking back tears and barely able to finish the sentence. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The mask of her anger slips and the grief pours out, and our passage says she falls at Jesus' feet weeping. Martha's affected by this death. Mary's affected by this death. Even Jesus is affected by the horrors of death. Those who grew up in church probably know the shortest verse in the English translation of the Bible is John 11:35. Jesus wept. Just two little words. And yet those two little words reveal so much about the character of God as revealed through Jesus Christ. God is not sitting up in heaven just zapping our loved ones and then leaving us alone to cry about it. No, Jesus wept. God is affected by the death of God's beloved children. John reminds us over and over again that he who has seen Jesus has seen God, the Father, the God, the parent. And that means if Jesus weeps, God is also weeping. Death is so horrible, so tragic, so seemingly final. It causes so much pain and suffering and confusion that even Jesus wept. Even God weeps. So again, I say, death is the worst. Over and over again in John 11, we are reminded of how terrible death is. The person that Jesus loved is now rotting in a tomb, has been for 4 days. There's no embalming fluid in those days. There's no mortuary arts that can make the body look like it's sleeping. No, when Jesus suggests opening the tomb, all the pretense, all the euphemisms, all the platitudes are stripped away. No longer is anyone able to say Lazarus is sleeping or Lazarus has gone away to heaven. No, you can see when Jesus suggests rolling away that stone, you can see the horror in everyone's faces. This idea of acknowledging death as it truly is. Martha shouts, "Lord, by now he stinks." Jesus is threatening to unveil death, to pull away the curtain of funeral parlor flowers and the green, freshly cut cemetery grass and all those nice things that we use to soften the blow of death. And Jesus is threatening to pull all that away and show the rot and the stink and the decay, to show the body returning to the dust. And in that moment, you realize how truly terrible death is. Our entire time on this earth is a journey through this valley of the shadow of death. It can seem like the universe is just this cold, uncaring machine that's just waiting to devour everything beautiful, everything good, everything, period. In light of this horror that haunts our human existence, what do we do? Why not just try to ignore it, right? Why not just try not to think about it and just enjoy our lives while we can? Why do we spend Ash Wednesday remembering that we are dust? Why do we spend 40 days of Lent thinking about death? I think part of the reason is When we ignore the reality of death, we have a hard time showing others the love of God. Jesus says elsewhere in the book of John, greater love has no one than this, than the one who lays down their life for a friend. When we ignore this reality of death, we have a hard time laying down our lives. It seems strange, but isn't that how it works? I think there's a part of us that wants to deny death. We want to pretend we're something we're not. We want to pretend that if we hold on tight enough, we will live forever. If we do the right things, if we eat the right things, if we act the right way, we're going to live forever, and somehow it won't happen to us. And that part of us sometimes holds on a little too tightly. And ironically, the tighter we grasp onto our lives, the more that death seems to reign in the world around us. Because when we're grasping at our own lives, we can't give anything up. We grasp onto money, we grasp onto power, we grasp onto weapons that we think will defend us, and fame that we think will leave us a legacy, and anything we think will protect us from that finality, that horror of death. Anything that will prevent us from having to roll away that stone and see and smell and feel the reality. In our grasping, we fail to give to others. In our attempts to ignore death, we make fists. We grasp, we make fists that we fight each other with instead of open hands that we can reach out and offer help to others with. In our attempts to ignore death, in our attempts to pretend that we are more than dust, in our attempts to pretend that through our own striving, through our own efforts, we can just keep going. We can keep what we have now, and it can just keep going forever. And we become more and more entangled in this web of death, which is why during Lent, we connect this idea of fasting, this idea of giving something up, with this idea that we are dust. During Lent, we remember how futile, how impossible it is to beat death because we are just dust. What can we do against the most powerful force in creation, this force that destroys people and cities and nations and planets and stars and universes? What can we do against death? On our own, we can do nothing. And yet, we can face death without losing hope. We can roll away that stone and we can look death in the eye, and it doesn't have to end in utter despair. In John 11, Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He asks Martha and he asks all of us, do you believe this? This isn't a question of whether or not we believe the right facts about Jesus, whether or not we could say the creed, or whether or not we could pass a test. This is a question about trust. The question is, do you trust that Jesus is who he says he is? I am the resurrection and the life. Is the I am that Jesus claims to be true? Is that I am that we see do such wonderful works all over the Old Testament? Is that same I am still the resurrection and the life today? Even as we live in the midst of death, can we believe Jesus' words? I am the resurrection and the life. Imagine what we could do if we fully believed those words. Could we live with a generosity that seems crazy to the world around us? Could we love recklessly? Could we lay down our lives? What could we do if we really believed I am the resurrection and the life? If we really believed that the lives that we try to grasp at are merely dust, if we really believed that our true lives, our eternal lives, were rooted in the one who made us from the dust and can make us again, the one who makes beautiful things out of the dust, what could we do if we saw our lives as rooted in the great I am, the one who makes all things new, the one who has defeated death, the one who has robbed death of its victory, the one who has taken away death's sting. What could we do if we believed in him? Could we love more? Could we give more? Could we care more? Could we let down those walls that keep us from others? Could we put down those weapons? Could we maybe even roll away the stone from the tomb? Could we look death right in the face, knowing that we will one day be there in that tomb, but also knowing that we have a good shepherd who knows our name and is ready to call his sheep, Lazarus, come forth. At the end of our passage, Lazarus walks out of his tomb, still wrapped in his burial cloth, his hands and feet still bound together in a reminder that his death was real. The pain that the mourners felt was real. The tears that are still drying on Jesus' face were real. Death is powerful, and death is ugly, and death is horrifying and terrible, and there's only one that can defeat it. But that one can defeat it so utterly that death becomes not an end to life, but the beginning of something new. Jesus said to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Do you believe this? Do we believe this? May we say with Martha, "Yes, Lord, I believe." Will you join me in saying the Lord's Prayer together as the beloved children of God? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Go forth this week and know that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and believe in those words. Go in peace.